Good morning. I'm Steve Morgan. I'm a retired landscape architect, naturalist, and Chautauquan performer is Aldo Leopold. We're here to celebrate the centennial of the Gila Wilderness, which Aldo Leopold was very influential in making happen. The Gila Wilderness is our first national wilderness and actually first wilderness area in the world designated that way. This is part of a series called Starting Conversations that's sponsored by the New Mexico Humanities Council. So if we can begin, follow me inside. Good morning. My name's Aldo Leopold. Welcome to the Pitchfork Ranch.
Thank you for having us today. My name is Henry Provencio. I'm the former district ranger for the Wilderness Ranger District on the Gila National Forest. I've worked for the Forest Service for about 30 years now, and happy to say that I manage a good portion of the Gila Wilderness, the first designated wilderness in the world. My guest joined the Forest Service in 1909 and was sent to District 3 in the Arizona and New Mexico territories. In 1914, he was signed to district headquarters in Albuquerque, where in 1922, he actually submitted a proposal to make the Gila Wilderness happen. He left the Forest Service in 1928, and in 1935, he assisted in founding the Wilderness Society. June 3rd of this year, 2024, will mark the 100-year anniversary of the Gila Wilderness, the first designated wilderness in the world. Today's discussion will be the old ranger talking to the new ranger, and we'll be comparing things that have changed and things that have stayed the same. Please welcome Aldo Leopold.
Thank you.
Aldo, I know you came out west.
You're going to have to speak up.
Yeah, you've been dead a while, haven't you? So Aldo, I know you came out west in 1909. Can you tell us a little bit about your childhood and kind of the things that shaped who you are?
Well, I was born in 1887 in Burlington, Iowa. And my grandparents had a home up on the bluffs above the Mississippi River. And it was an ideal place to grow up because there were muddy draws, there were creeks, there were little limestone caves. I know I was often a little bit late for my class at school because there were so many things to see, so many places to explore. And at that time, there was still a lot of wild. And it was a very special place to grow up. And so being able to go out and get immersed in nature at that time was a wonderful experience, and it stayed with me my whole life.
Wow, sounds fantastic, and I know we're all grateful for those experiences. So when you moved out west in 1909, you came to Arizona and the New Mexico territories. What'd you find? What was it like out here?
Wilderness. I remember taking the train from Albuquerque to Holbrook, which was in the Arizona territory. And then from there we got onto a stagecoach, which was a 2-day drive on a very dusty road all the way down to Springerville. And at that time, I remember we arrived in the evening, and Springerville was a tiny little town with a few lights, and everything was black all around us. And I just remember being so excited because this was the Wild West, and I was there, and I was very excited to be there. But it was wilderness everywhere around us. That road was the only way in, and there were no vehicles at that time. We did everything by horseback.
Yeah, I don't think it's changed that much. The roads are paved, probably some more lights, but it's still a very small community. So can you share some of the experiences that maybe shaped the way you thought about wilderness in these remote areas?
I've been keeping a journal since I was 9 or 10. And at my age now, I have those journals to refer back to. And so many of the stories and the things that I write about now are based on what I wrote 30, 40 years ago. And so when I look back at those early moments on the Apache National Forest, I was not quite as smart as I thought I was, I think, at that time, because the turn of the century was a very different time period than now in the 40s, or even now in your time. But the key thing that I remember from then was the wildness. We still had grizzly bears. We still had all of the predators, the wolves. And in fact, one of the main experiences I had that, looking back on it about 30 years later, I realized that it changed my life a lot, was I was only on the job, I think 2, maybe 3 weeks. I was new. And I was out with my supervisor. And we were up on the Black River and taking a break. And we saw what we thought was a doe crossing the river below us. And it turned out it was a wolf, a she-wolf. And then we saw her cubs all turn out on the other side to come out and meet her. Well, at that time, I was young, full of trigger itch, and truly felt that fewer wolves meant more deer, and no wolves was a hunter's paradise. And in that thinking, we didn't understand the importance of the predators. We didn't understand how everything already worked in the wild areas. And so when I look back on it 30 years later, I realized that it changed me, because when she died, there was a fierce green fire that I watched. And actually, as I held my rifle out between me and her, because she was dying, but she lunged at my rifle, and then I watched that light die. Well, being in such a wild setting, she was part of the mountain. She was part of that whole system that was there already. And with her gone, I realized that something had changed. And even though it took me almost 30 years to realize what that change meant, it changed my life at the same time.
Well, I really want to thank you for taking a moment to write that down in your journals. And I couldn't tell you for certain, but that is one of the most widely published things that you have written, and probably impacted more people to the awareness of keeping the systems intact, both predators and prey. It's one of the most watershed moments, I think, of your career. You may not realize that now, but that really struck a chord with many folks. So thank you for writing that down.
Well, at the time, it was another wolf.
Sure.
We were sportsmen. We wanted the game, and they were competition.
You bet. Let me ask you, When we're talking about wilderness, did you feel an urgency in 1922 or even before to set aside these places?
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that urgency and what was driving that?
In 1909, when I first arrived in Springerville, we did everything on horseback. There were no cars. Later, I've discovered with some numbers to explain what we were seeing, because we were seeing the wild lands disappear quickly. We were finding vehicles in places that we had no idea how they even got in there. They didn't get out, but they got in. And so a lot of the areas that we really considered to be very wild, we're losing that. And it wasn't just the vehicles, but it was also just the number of people that were coming and wanted to be out in the wilderness areas. There was also this thing that I know I've written about, commodity versus community. And so many of the people that were coming out there looked upon the wildlands as commodity. It was something, it was resources, and the Forest Service felt the same way, to use the resources. And in doing so, we were not considering the entire ecology. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of things were being damaged. And I was seeing more and more of that as I spent more time in the Southwest. Overgrazing. That was one of the things I remember seeing, was when I went on the Carson as supervisor, was I felt that the stockman needed to understand that his grazing of livestock on public lands was not a right, but it was a privilege. And with that privilege came the responsibility to treat the land with love and respect. And that was not something that we saw. And because of it, we had all kinds, huge areas that were being overgrazed. The erosion was terrible. We were watching habitats disappear. And it was all because of this commodity, this feeling like, one thing I know I've said is, the last word in ignorance is that of a man who says of a plant or an animal, what good is it? Mm-hmm. It was that attitude of commodity, to where it's there for me to use in whatever way I wish. And that's what I really felt we needed to change. And we were seeing just so much of our lands disappearing quickly. So in 22, I met with Fred Wynn, who's a good friend of mine, who was supervisor on the Gila National Forest. And Fred felt the same way. We both had seen so many changes, because he started with the Forest Service before I did. But we had seen so many changes, and we knew that we needed to do something. I had originally started, I think, in 1913, and nobody was interested. They just didn't see the use of putting aside wild lands. Mm-hmm. And even in 1922, when I first put that together, the proposal, they weren't ready for it. And so my proposal actually got lost in a desk for almost 2 years.
Wow.
We realized that we needed to do something about this. So I met with Fred. We toured the area that he thought on the Gila National Forest that would work, which turned out to be the lands that we did set aside. But it was actually, I got asked to transfer back to Madison, Wisconsin, to the Forest Products Laboratory as assistant director. And there was enough opposition to my way of thinking that we needed to be changing out on District 3, that we just, I needed a change. And it was a hard one.
I could understand that. I guess, what kind of role did maybe Arthur Carhart play, and did you have conversations with him? And it seems like you might have been kindred souls, maybe working in different areas. And did that provide you any kind of confidence that this was the right thing to do?
It reignited my feeling that we really needed to do something. I was at a conference in Salt Lake City, and speaking to one of my fellow foresters, and I was telling him about how I really felt we needed to set lands aside. And he said, I have a young man working in my office now, and it was in Denver. He said, you should talk to him. So I did. I stopped on my way back to Albuquerque. I stopped in Denver and met with Arthur. And Arthur was young. He was the first landscape architect for the Forest Service, which nobody knew what that meant at the time. In fact, everybody working around him called him a beauty engineer. They didn't know what he could do. But his first assignment was at Trapper Lake up in Colorado. And he was supposed to lay out cabin sites around the lake. And when he got up there, he started to do that, but then he realized this wasn't right. This was a place that should not be just solely for the benefit of the wealthy, but should be something that's set aside for the benefit of all. And so that was in his report, and that's why I ended up talking to him. And we spoke for a good part of a day, and that spurred me to rewrite the proposal and to submit it.
Well, thank you. Thank you for doing that. And
thank Arthur and Fred, and there was a lot of people involved.
And so Mr. Pooler was the Region 3
Frank
or
Pooler.
District 3. Frank Pooler was what we call now the regional forester at the time. He seemed to be receptive. I mean, he was originally the person who signed off. Can you talk a little bit about your relationship with him and maybe what he was thinking about in terms of designating wilderness?
It was the Forest Recreational Plan that we submitted to him. And in that plan was the section about setting aside lands in the Gila National Forest to become a wilderness area. So that was only pertinent to, well, we called them districts back then. It's region now, Region 3, and the 11 Forest. So it was only pertinent to that region.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't apply to the rest of the national forests throughout the United States. But it did set aside one of the most remaining wild areas that either one of us knew about. Enough people supported it that I think it was like, I want to say 4 days. I had just moved my family back to Wisconsin.
Yeah.
When we got the word that Frank had signed it. But it was just the recreational plan. And I know from then, there was a constant battle to keep those lands and to keep people respecting what we had hoped would happen there.
Right.
But it's a constant battle.
I can vouch for that. In 1923, it was a designation by the district or regional forester at that time. And you may not know this, but 40 years later, Congress thought that it was important enough to make it a law. So in 1964, 60 years ago.
So it took 40 years.
It took 40 years, but it happened, and it became the Wilderness Act. We now have 806 designated wildernesses within the United States, and nearly 112 million acres.
Wow.
Managed by.
That's progress.
That's a lot of progress, and you're international because there's actually, I believe, 44 countries throughout the world who designate some form of wilderness, and it really all started right here in our backyard on the Gila National Forest in the Gila Wilderness. So thank you for that foresight. Thank you for continuing to work hard on something that was a bit controversial, and I'm sure you received a little backlash from that, but thanks.
There was a lot of people, though, that really did support it. I mean, 1935, Bob Marshall came to me and we decided we were losing too many of the wild lands that had already been put aside, and so we formed the Wilderness Society. And the whole purpose was to fight to keep the wilderness areas. But, one thing that we did realize, in a wilderness area, the idea was to preserve the natural communities as intact as we possibly could. I mean, the original idea for wilderness was having an area that was still in its native state, large enough to hold a 2-week pack trip, but kept devoid of roads, any cabins, any other works of man. But the idea originally had a lot to do with preserving game in those areas where they weren't going to be disturbed. But what we realized was that was also a place where we could have a land laboratory. It's a place where we could study the ecology systems in their native situation, where that's who they were. That's what we needed to study. Because here we were charged with managing these lands, but we didn't understand them. And so we needed a place that we could study them. And you can't do that. You can't study something like, say, a desert in Arizona from New York or someplace. You have to be there.
Right.
And so that's part of it too, is getting the experience of what is there in those wild lands. And we also realized too that wilderness was not just mountaintops and deep canyons. It
Right.
needed to include all of our ecosystems, and we were working on that. I think Boundary Waters up in Minnesota was one of the next ones, and that was one actually that Arthur Carhart, that was the next one that he took on and made happen too. So
Yeah.
he accomplished a lot.
Can you speak to kind of that original intent? Where I think the term wilderness kind of came a little bit later, but I think the original intent was about game, right? And about keeping all those component pieces and allowing natural processes to take their place. Can you speak a little bit about what you were originally thinking? I had heard that maybe you were wanting to call these areas like game refuge or something to that effect originally, and then it kind of evolved into this concept of wilderness.
It was actually under President Roosevelt where we did actually set aside game refuges for that purpose. But the wilderness areas were larger areas tended to be. But it was also, when I mentioned the laboratory, we needed a large enough tract of land that was still intact. And it was it was keeping these systems in a large enough area to where you could have a full community. I've talked about commodity versus community, and we've seen our lands abused because we thought of them as commodity. You know, if the biota over a course of eons has created something that works well, but we don't understand it, who but a fool would discard seemingly useless parts? To keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution to intelligent tinkering. I realized later that the attitude that we had towards predators was this. We took the predators, which were a very important cog in all these systems, we took them out. We caused a lot of problems. The deer explosions, just an imbalance, because they were already, it was working, but we didn't understand it. And so having those wilderness areas set aside, our intention was to have the entire system, including the predators, in a place where they could thrive and do what they, had evolved to do.
So instead of trying to conquer your community, it was trying to be a part of the community and allow all those components.
Respect the community and be part of it.
Yeah, great. Love that.
So tell me a little more. I'm very curious in the time since I passed, what has happened? You've mentioned a few things like the Wilderness Act in 1964. What else has happened?
Well, since your passing in 1948, sorry about that, but you look great. It was a bit of an environmental movement into the 60s. So post-World War II, you had a lot of vets coming home. There was another war in Korea after that. in the 50s. And there was a lot of extractive uses really ramping up in the national forest systems, right? We had to provide wood and resources for returning vets and to allow everyone that American dream of having a house. On or about in the 60s, 1960s and 70s, there was a bit of an environmental movement where there were massive outcries to protect the environment. And we see lots of acts being passed by Congress, including the Wilderness Act. And they were all designed with a natural resource intent. From 1924 to about 1964, there was a lot of ebb and flow about just exactly what is wilderness. I was the district ranger at our wilderness district, and we have archives that you can go back and look at the authors of the Wilderness Act in 1964, trying to figure out just exactly what you meant by some of the things that you were proposing. How did grazing fit into wilderness? Obviously, roads were not something that were going to be allowed. But what about all these other types of uses, and how could they be applied in the wilderness system and codified in the 1964 Act? So it's really a fascinating conversation for folks trying to figure out just exactly what did Aldo mean. So in 1964, when the Wilderness Act was finally signed, it required agencies to manage for 5 characteristics of wilderness that really came from your vision of wilderness. Those 5 characteristics are untrammeled, natural, undeveloped, areas of solitude or undeveloped recreation, and then other features of value, because I think when folks wrote the Wilderness Act, they were thinking that areas that maybe had cultural significance to maybe Native American tribes should be considered included in the wilderness system. So the Act actually did tell us how we were supposed to manage for those things, and they were all based on interpretations of what you and others had originally written when you set aside the Gila Wilderness. So it's a pretty cool thing. I would say there's been ebbs and flows in the Gila Wilderness in particular. They made them primitive areas, then they made them kind of study areas. The boundaries expanded and contracted. The actual designation that you originally had proposed was split in 2. And now you have a namesake wilderness area, the Aldo Leopold, which encompasses the Black Range. That didn't actually happen until 1980. But the beauty of it is all of these areas are set aside where man is only a visitor. And the idea and the intent of it is that you can truly get away. It's unconfined. You're not confined to a roadway or a trail system. That you can go and experience the full wilderness in all its glory. So it's a pretty amazing thing. And,
That was our intent. That's what
well, good job.
we felt that needed to happen because it was a part of our way of life as in the United States that we were losing. And then we felt, future generations wouldn't know anything about it, and that wasn't right.
Well, you had mentioned roads earlier, and I believe, I don't know how many cars there were in say 1948 when you passed, but I read something recently, and I believe it was something in the neighborhood of 278 million vehicles in the United States alone. So good on you for not having roads in the wilderness areas.
Well, in 1900, I think they thought there were around 8,000 cars in the whole United States. By 1930, I think it was 23 million. And so that was what we were seeing, was just this incredible explosion of the population. And people wanted out. People wanted to go to these forests. They wanted to go to these wild areas. The national parks, I know their usage was going up rapidly. So that's why we felt we had to put some of this land aside. So I'm very pleased that there's 806 now, you say?
806 wilderness areas. In
And
the
they're covering
United
all different
States.
kinds, all the different ecosystems, and
Yes, sir. Smallest is about 6 acres, and it's an island, Pelican Island, south of Florida, which is a little different. I think you guys were talking more about 5,000 to 100,000 acres.
but if it's an ecosystem that is intact,
Right,
then that's what counts.
right. Yeah, and you know, we talked about the vehicles, and that is a threat that we still have to our wilderness systems, is we have some vehicles that are capable of just almost going up a sheer wall. And so trying to manage these wilderness areas so that we don't have incursions from vehicles, because it's kind of that issue where once there's a set of tracks, the next person follows those tracks and takes them a little farther and a little farther, and before you know it, you know, you're deep
You have a road.
into a wilderness area, right?
Yeah.
So that's a constant battle, but thankfully the vast majority of our users are respectful and understand that you can't take mechanized equipment into the wilderness.
The opportunity for our youth is so important, to have those areas like that, to where they can go out there and they can experience those things. That was one of the things I know with my students, the graduate students at University of Wisconsin. I like to teach differently. That's the way I was taught by my father, but he was a quiet teacher. But he gave us opportunities to discover on our own. And whenever we would have a new class, I was always able to surprise them, because they figured that they'd be sitting at a desk and going through textbooks. And I would always say, let's go outside. And we would go for a walk. And it was listening to their comments of nature when we were outside on the campus that I would often ask them questions about what they were saying. And they started understanding the importance of doing their work out in the field. That was the experience that you needed to have. And so when we have the wild areas, particularly for our youth, because when we're young, we don't have the boundaries. We don't have those limits set upon us the way that we do as adults. And so it's so important to be able to expand that and to explore.
I appreciate that. And I think as real as it was in your day, it is real for us today. And there are massive efforts to get underserved communities out into the wilderness, to experience the wilderness. And this may have been a transition over the last 100 years, but our underserved communities typically are people of color that are in very populated areas, and they don't have the means to get out to the wilderness, or even maybe the understanding of what the wilderness is. So we try to create those opportunities for them to be able to experience the wilderness, frankly, as you intended. There's quite the gap between those who have and those who have not in their ability to experience the wilderness. The beauty of preserving these places is that they're still there. And we can continue to work to get folks out there and have a wilderness experience, because it's still there.
So what do you see happening in the next 100 years after your time?
You know, that's a really interesting question. As I was preparing for this conversation with you, I was very interested to see how people were using the wilderness in your time. And it seems fairly obvious that people were probably not recreating with backpacks as much as they were hunting, maybe with a pack animal, fishing, those game and fish type experiences. Ironically, the uses are very much the same, because you aren't allowed to have mechanized equipment. There are no roads in the wilderness. You need to throw on a backpack if you want to experience the wilderness, or have a pack trip with pack animals, horses.
They've kept that intact for
absolutely. We're no
so a few things have been done
uses. Right. Well, thank you. You set it up. And so I think largely the uses are the same. Now, as people navigate, they're using handheld devices connected to satellites in outer space to help guide them. Might be a little more secure that maybe they're not going to get lost or maybe not get the full wilderness experience. But other than that, I think people really look the same when they're out in the wilderness. They're sleeping in the dirt, they're getting their water from the creek, and they're having the same kind of experiences.
They're finding joy?
I hope so. I hope so. That solitude and unconfined type of recreation, that seeing the stars, you don't see that in the city anymore. I just was reading a story about a firefighter who was in the wilderness in the Gila. He's from the city, and he felt like somebody had their flashlight above him all night. But he never really turned over to see what it was, and it was the moon. He'd never quite experienced the moon that way. And it just seems so simple to us, but I think that goes back to getting some of the folks out of the city and experiencing the wilderness as it is in all its glory.
Well, thank you for what you're doing in your time.
Well, thank you, and I'm about ready to be done, and looking forward to seeing what the next generation will bring. As far as the next 100 years, I hope it looks exactly the same, that the natural systems are allowed to function, the disturbance regimes are allowed to take place as they would. You may not know this, but the Mexican wolf was on the brink of extinction. We actually had to bring just very few animals from Mexico and from zoos. And now we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 260 animals in the wilderness, and that may not sound like much to you, but it's a whole lot for us, and we're headed in the right direction.
With the hand that I had and how many of our predators disappeared, I'm very happy to hear that.
Yeah.
What's the situation with the other predators, the mountain lions and bears?
They are all holding their own. No grizzly bears. I think those may have been extirpated by the time you had passed away,
Yeah.
I think in the 40s. And I don't see those ever making a comeback here in the Southwest. But the other predators seem to be doing well. The game management associations, the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish, Arizona Game and Fish, do actually manage for those threatened and endangered species, along with the Fish and Wildlife Service, to ensure that we have those critters here for a very long time.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.